On this edition of FedGov Today with Francis Rose, potential long-term pain from short-term budget gain.
If they don't backfill that money themselves in the base budget, then you're just left with a hole that's unfilled. And so I think that is the big risk going into FY27, and that's what's creating a lot of uncertainty.
Defense budget expert Todd Harrison of AEI on FedGov Today in just a moment. First, though, a roadmap is missing for 8 of the biggest legacy information technology systems in government. The Government Accountability Office's Kevin Walsh will tell you what's missing and what's next this Sunday morning on FedGov Today TV. You can watch the debut on ABC7 in Washington and on the FedGov Today YouTube channel at 10:30 Sunday morning. If you miss the debut, you can watch anytime at fedgovtoday.com and on YouTube. The Trump administration's budget proposal for the Defense Department for fiscal 2026 is $848 billion. But the real number the Pentagon gets will be a lot different no matter how it winds up getting the money. Todd Harrison is senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's writing about the defense budget under the title, Is Reconciliation the New OCO? Todd, it's great to talk to you again. We've been doing this now, you and I, for many years, talking about the form and substance of the Defense Department's budget. Why did you think it was important to ask this question and then answer it later in this piece that we'll talk about? Why is it important to ask the question, though, to begin with? Welcome.
Oh, thanks, Francis. Yes, and we've been discussing these kind of issues for many years, and now it is a whole new flavor on the debate. And really, it's where does the regular peacetime cost of the military get funded? If you go back 10, 12 years ago, during the Budget Control Act days when there was a cap on the maximum level of the base defense budget allowed, there was an exception to that cap, and that was known as OCO, Overseas Contingency Operations, which funded the war costs of Iraq and Afghanistan. The loophole was you could put base budget money into the OCO budget, and it wouldn't count towards your cap, right? And so DOD and Congress used that loophole throughout the 2010s to get around the budget caps that Congress itself put in place. Now Congress is doing something kind of similar, but they're using the reconciliation process, which is a very different budget mechanism. And that's got people speculating, are we just going to use reconciliation like we used to use OCO, where we can keep the base budget where it appears to be artificially low, but we get extra money every year using this other end run around the budgetary process? That is, the question I was trying to answer.
So you write in this piece, and we'll put a link to it in the show notes today on the show page at fedgovtoday.com. You write, it wasn't honest budgeting, but it worked because there was bipartisan buy-in. There was a lot of sound and fury about reconciliation in the most recent incident of it, but ultimately it wound up working. Does that mean that that's a marker moving forward, or is this potentially a one-off depending on what's included the next time around, or is there just no way to crystal ball it at this point, Todd?
I tend to view it as more of a one-off, right? Because if you go back to OCO funding, we got OCO funding every single year because we had troops in harm's way, and neither party wanted to be seen as denying troops the funding that they needed. So you could always get that war funding pushed through. And once you've opened the door to that, it's pretty easy to tack on some additional base defense budget funding in there as well. Reconciliation is different because it doesn't work on a bipartisan basis. It specifically requires single party control of all of government, of the White House, of the House, and the Senate. That's the only way reconciliation is really going to work. And it is doing it on a party line basis vote in both chambers. Right. And so, that I think in itself means it will not continue to work indefinitely, because you look at American history, we don't have unified control of government for very long. That is not typical.
Right.
So after the midterm elections, there's a pretty good chance that one or both chambers of Congress are going to flip party control, and then reconciliation goes out the window.
And the next time it could potentially come in the window would then be for the fiscal 29. Am I figuring that right? fiscal 29 budget cycle.
Fiscal year 30, once you have a new White House. And
right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. See, I can't even keep track of all of it, Todd. You also write in this piece, like OCO, reconciliation sidesteps traditional budget rules and processes. Is that where the parallel ends in your mind, in addition? Because you just laid out the explanation for why politically it's a different animal than OCO was.
Yeah. I think that's where the similarity really ends, right? Because OCO followed the supplemental appropriations process in Congress, which is more expedited. You don't go through the same process of submitting a request a year in advance or anything like that, and you're able to get it through, on an expedited basis. Reconciliation is similar but different, because you can push things through on an expedited basis. The workaround, though, ends up being, and this was the first time we've ever had significant defense funding in a reconciliation bill. The workaround is all that defense funding has to be classified as mandatory funding instead of discretionary. So we're going to see some really weird spikes on our budget charts in the future years, because all of a sudden we're going to have over $150 billion in extra mandatory funding for defense, which we've never had before. But that is the workaround, that gets it through the process on an expedited basis. And in particular, it gets it through the Senate, only requiring a simple majority vote, not 60 votes like things usually require.
You also write, reconciliation lacks OCO's moral leverage and budget ambiguity because it largely funds regular acquisition programs. That means, and you point this out, there are no troops at risk, just programs that quietly die on the vine. What's the implication of that then for the stuff that maybe, as you said, when Congress changes, maybe program priorities change? A new administration comes along in a couple of years, potentially, new program priorities exist. And it strikes me that's not just a challenge for the building, that's a challenge for the DIB when everybody's talking about certainty in the defense industrial base and so on. It strikes me this maybe exacerbates that uncertainty problem rather than trying to help calm it.
It does. It really does exacerbate it, because typically your acquisition programs, you get a 5-year plan with every budget request. And so you can see not only what are they requesting, what do they need this year, what they're going to need next year and the year after and so forth. The reconciliation bill, it doesn't come with a 5-year plan. In fact, it wasn't, the line items in there were not requested by the administration. There were things put in there by the armed services committees in Congress. And if you go to the armed services committees, and what they said is they intended this not to substitute for things that should be funded in the base budget, but to be a supplement over and above what DOD was normally going to get. But the administration, the Trump administration, their budget request, they didn't use it that way. They used it in many cases to substitute for things that DOD would have bought. But DOD, knowing the reconciliation funding was coming, DOD took the money out of their base budget, just knowing that the hole would be filled by reconciliation. So it ended up substituting rather than supplementing in many cases.
All right. And to that point, then, you ask a couple of rhetorical questions. Will DOD again bet on reconciliation in the FY27 request, or will it revert to a more sustainable strategic approach that requests the funding and actually thinks the military needs? And then you write, this is where the RICO, reconciliation, to OCO comparison ultimately fails. Why is that the point where one can discern, no, it's not the same as what the Congress did before?
Yeah, so this is where, we have a lot of uncertainty because, and this is typical in a new administration, their first budget request, they did not include a 5-year plan. So we don't know what the Pentagon is planning for their FY27 budget request. And the question is, okay, are they going to keep it low? Are they going to keep it flat at the current level and just hope or assume that Congress adds reconciliation money above it? If Congress doesn't add that reconciliation money, then we are going to see the defense budget come crashing down, right? They've advertised, it's $1 trillion defense budget. That's if you include all the reconciliation money. If that money is not there in future years and they don't make up for it in the base budget, you're going to be looking at a significant year-over-year decline in defense. That's where it becomes a real problem for DoD. If they haven't, but these things that they counted on reconciliation substituting for in their base budget, if they don't backfill that money themselves in the base budget, then you're just left with a hole that's unfilled. And so I think that is the big risk going into FY27, and that's what's creating a lot of uncertainty. Even in some of the highest priority programs of the administration, like Golden Dome. Golden Dome is very high priority for this administration. There's about $25 billion in funding for it in the reconciliation bill. Zero funding for Golden Dome in the base defense budget. So if they don't somehow find a way to put Golden Dome funding in there for FY27, they're just betting that whole program on another reconciliation bill.
That may or may not be there, especially 2 years and 4 years from now. Todd, great insight as always. It's always a pleasure to catch up with you. Thanks for talking to me today.
All right. Thanks, Francis.
You can find a link to Todd's piece on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. The next FedGov Today podcast is coming next Tuesday. To make sure you don't miss it, follow the FedGov Today podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever else you get your shows. And you can always listen on demand at fedgovtoday.com. I'm Francis Rose. Thanks very much for listening.